my head the night before was the Confederate White House. The first capital of the Confederacy was in Montgomery, Alabama. And the White House, the government of the Confederacy, was right there, blocks away from the Greyhound station, where those freedom riders had pulled in, trying to break the hold that segregation had on interstate bus travel, blocks away from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that Dr. King preached at, blocks away from the office where he and E.B. Nixon and Rosa Parks organized the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, all in the same city. It's enough to break your brain. It's enough that it happened in the same country, but in the same city, that the power of history and what it tells us about who we are today. I mean, that's what this book is about. And it's what this moment is about. I was talking to my friend Kat earlier. We were talking about what motivates us to stay in these fights. How do we stay focused? How do we make sure that we give it all that we've got? And what I learned over the course of spending years with you all on the road, first against Ted Cruz for the United States Senate in 17 and 18, and then in 22 in that governor's race, is that it's not ever going to be about a person. It's never going to be about a political party. It's going to be about the people who come together at these moments of truth. We did that in 17 and 18. I remember prior to that, I had been in Congress. I had done my best to serve veterans who had served our country on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, on the House Armed Services Committee, these last two bastions of bipartisanship that still exist in America. And I was able to deliver. I was a Democrat, minority, Republican majority institution. I was even able to get Donald Trump to sign bills that we had written into law, find enough common ground with that guy on whom I could agree on almost nothing. But if it was going to serve our country, my community, we were going to try. And sometimes we were successful. But when he got elected in 16, I remember turning to my wife and she to me. And the look, when you've been married for a while, you don't even need to use words. We knew that what we were doing was simply not enough. It was insufficient to the task at hand. Not only was this guy promising to turn back 8 years of what President Barack Obama had accomplished, he wanted to turn back decades of progress in this country. This Make America Great Again was about taking America back into the past, into a very dark, unconstitutional, and undemocratic past. And to make it personal for us in El Paso, he spoke about my hometown, one of the safest places in America, not in spite of the fact that it's a city of immigrants, but because it is a city of immigrants. As this war zone, these rapists and criminals were coming in to get us. These animals, he called them. He called them an infestation, which is what we call a cockroach or a rat or something to kill and exterminate. We knew this was not going to be good for our country, and we knew we had to do something better than what we were doing right now. We made this decision to run for Senate. Even though Texas had last elected a Democrat to the Senate in 1988, it was Lloyd Bentsen. Last elected a Democrat to any statewide office in 1994. Ted Cruz, he was the runner-up for the Republican nomination for president. He had universal name ID. He had campaign cash coming out of his ears. Nobody knew who I was. I had sworn off PAC money. How were we going to do this? We didn't know, but we knew that we had to try. We made a virtue of a necessity, and we got out there. We went to every one of the 254 counties. I met you here in Tarrant. I met you in Dallas County. I met you in every single place in this state. You could not be too red for us to show up, because I wanted to make sure you knew that I was never going to write you off. And you could not be too blue for us to take you for granted. And the awful secret no longer within the Democratic Party, is that some of the most reliable voters for Democrats in the bluest precincts in this state, for example, overwhelmingly black and brown, have been taken for granted by Democrats. You're already going to vote for the Democrat. Why should I show up and listen to you and learn from you and reflect what I've heard in the campaign that I run and the service that I provide? I'm going to go chase that white suburban soccer mom. She is the ticket to my victory. That was the conventional wisdom and the thinking preceding our race. But we threw all of that out the window. We didn't have a consultant because we couldn't afford one. It was hard for us to find a campaign manager because no one would take this race seriously. You got to be kidding me. In Texas, it's not going to happen. We just relied on the people. We went everywhere, listened to everybody, and wrote nobody off. And as you know, at the end of the day, though we did not defeat Ted Cruz, we came very, very, very close. 215,000 votes close, about 2.5% of the vote. Largest voter turnout in Texas history. We won the 5 major metro areas for the first time since LBJ was on the ticket in 1964. We all together delivered Tarrant County for the first time in forever. Young people turned out at a rate 500% over the last midterm election. And then down ballot, this is so important to remember, something really special happened. Colin Allred wins a race that nobody predicted he was going to win. He serves with distinction in the House of Representatives. He is now our nominee, and he will beat Ted Cruz in November of 2024. The guy's going to get it done. We won state House seats, 12 of them Democrats picked up, beating 12 incumbent Republicans, the biggest seat change we had seen in that institution in years. And in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, we saw 18 Black women who won judicial elections, changing the face of criminal justice in the most diverse city in America. Now, all of those gains, all of that progress, all of those victories, they were not lost on the people in power, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the majority in the state house and the state senate. And they got to work almost immediately, changing our election laws. Every legislative session, 2019, 2021, 2023, to make it harder to vote until we became the toughest state in the nation, bar none, in which to cast a ballot or to register to vote, to get your name on the rolls, to be able to run for office, to participate in our politics, to have your vote counted or your voice heard. Something less than a democracy. And there came a moment for me, and you may feel it in your own life from time to time, and you may have even felt it then, where you wonder whether you should be in this fight at all going forward. You know, you paid your dues, you ran your races, you provided your service, you spent all that time away from your family, you gave it all you had, and now maybe it's time to get out of the way, to go somewhere else and lead a different life. And Amy and I've had that conversation. You know, is it just for us to raise a 15-year-old girl in a state that doesn't believe that she's a full human being capable of making her own decisions about her own body, her own future, and her own health care? Is it okay for our 3 kids to be going to public schools in Texas at a time that they're draining the resources out of those classrooms, and we lead the nation in the number of school shootings? Somehow those in power have decided the NRA and the gun lobby is more important than the lives of our kids in those classrooms. Maybe we got to move somewhere else where our lives are just a little bit more important, where our democracy works, where we don't have to worry about these things. That really was the impetus for writing this book. How do you overcome the temptation to despair? How do you not give in when everything and everyone, especially those in power, are telling you to do that? Doing the research and the writing, the listening to people who told me these stories, who are so much smarter on this stuff than I will ever be. I found the answers to these questions. And so many of them center on this guy that, if you've heard me talk before, you know his name, but if you haven't, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that he existed. This guy, Lawrence Aaron Nixon, was born in Marshall, Texas. I have to explain what Marshall, Texas is to the rest of the country. I don't have to do that for you. But I tell folks, you know, in the Civil War, as one Confederate state government fell after another, their administrations would move to Marshall, Texas. It was an important crossroads for the Confederacy. And long after Appomattox in 1865, it remained a bastion of Confederate resentment and white supremacy. And Nixon, who was born to a man who himself had been born enslaved, nonetheless flourishes. He attends and graduates from Wiley, one of our great HBCUs in the state, goes to Meharry Medical College in Tennessee, comes back to Texas, a doctor right at the beginning of the 20th century, and ultimately finds his way to El Paso in 1910. There, he becomes as civically engaged, as much of a leader as a man, as a person could be in the state of Texas, especially if your skin was black and you lived under Jim Crow as he did. Nonetheless, He founds the first chapter of the NAACP anywhere in Texas, and he does it in El Paso in 1915. He designs the bond elections that his fellow El Paso citizens are going to be voting on each election, and he never misses a chance to vote. Until in 1923, 101 years ago, the state legislature forbids voting by African Americans in Texas. And to be clear, and to kind of compare ourselves to some other states, they don't do this euphemistically. They don't say you have to pass a literacy test. You have to tell us how many jelly beans are in the jar before you register to vote. You have to recite the state constitution, and you are able to get past this if you pass the grandfather clause, which no African American at the time could pass in Texas because their grandparents have been enslaved. It wasn't that. In black and white, it said, if you are black, you will not vote in Texas. It was called the white primary law. And it was the Democratic primary, but there was no Republican primary in Texas at the time because the Republican Party was so small and so weak, they couldn't mount a convention, they couldn't put a ticket together. So not voting in the Democratic Party meant that you couldn't select your governor, your senator, your congressperson, your county commissioner, your justice of the peace, not any election that mattered on the ballot. 1924, the next year, 100 years ago, Nixon nonetheless pays his poll tax, which at the time in Texas was a requirement to be able to vote. Pays his poll tax, which is an article of faith in himself, in his country, and in our democracy, because the law of the land at the time said that he could not vote. It was going to be illegal for him to do that. Nonetheless, pays that poll tax, goes to fire station number 5 on Texas Ave. The building still stands in El Paso, his regular polling location, on election day, waits in line, gets to the front of the line, puts his poll tax receipt on the counter, and the election judge and the poll worker, both of whom recognize Nixon by sight because Nixon has never missed an election, they painfully tell him, Dr. Nixon, you know we can't let you vote. And Nixon responds, I know you can't, but I've got to try. He takes his case to the local federal district court. He loses it immediately. He and his attorney appeal it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where in 1927, they win this signal landmark Supreme Court decision that integrates elections in Texas, only to have the state legislature, that sounds a lot like the majority in power right now, convene under emergency session to change the election laws in Texas to circumvent the Supreme Court ruling. Once again, Nixon and every black Texan is disenfranchised. Once again, he pays his poll tax. Once again, he tries to vote. Once again, he is turned back. Once again, he takes his case to the local federal district court. Once again, he loses and appeals and wins another Supreme Court victory, this time in 1934, trying to vote every single election between that first rejection and this year, 1934. That's 10 years. And just imagine what's going through this guy's head. He knows not when, nor even if he is going to win. His family might have been telling him, hey, Dad, maybe we should move to a state where you can vote, where you're treated like a man, a human being, and a citizen. Dad, my friends are making fun of me at school. Maybe his colleagues and his friends are saying, hey, this is hurting your business right now, Dr. Nixon. You need to focus on work and providing for your family. Get out of this politics. The radio station in El Paso took to calling him every election day to put him on air, asking him if he was going to vote. Now, reading that anecdote, I've often wondered, did they do that to give others courage through Dr. Nixon's example? Or did they do that to mock him and to ridicule him and allow him to serve as entertainment for their listeners? Who is this crazy guy who thinks in Jim Crow, Texas, he's going to be able to vote? He's nuts. Nonetheless, this guy kept after it. His determination, his courage, his persistence until 1944, 20 years after he began. He wins the right to vote in a Supreme Court decision called Smith versus Albright. That year, he also pays his poll tax. He waits in line at fire station number 5, and this time, after he presents the receipt, he votes. 20 years, I just want you to think about. Sometimes we get tied up in a given candidate or campaign or a single election or one Supreme Court decision or something that does not go right in our lives at a given moment. We say, oh gosh, this is over. I give up. I guess voting doesn't matter. I guess the work doesn't pay off. I guess I should just give up and go somewhere else. 20 years in the wilderness, by himself, almost literally alone, this guy persisted in the fight. I'll tell you what, the victory was not limited to integration in our elections in 44. It is no accident that 20 years later, the first president from the state of Texas, who knew Nixon's story, not lost on him, LBJ, he's in the White House, in the Oval Office in particular, and he's meeting with Andrew Young and Dr. Martin Luther King. And the two of them are there to congratulate the president on passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mr. President, great job. You really did it. We have been working on this as a country for decades, really ever since the end of Reconstruction, almost 90 years. And it is you and your leadership, and you're willing to use your political capital to get it done, that has made it happen. And the president thanks them. And then King says, and now we would like to vote. Because though you have passed civil rights, these civil rights don't really mean anything unless we have the power to choose our government and to run for office and to have our voice heard and our vote counted. Mr. President, what are you going to do about it? And they remind him, in Selma, Alabama, it is an African-American majority population, but 99% of the voters on the rolls are white. This is a democracy, but in name only. Johnson says, you know, you're right. I want to help you. We really should be able to get this done, but I don't have the political power. I used it all up on civil rights. So I'm sorry, we're just not going to be able to make this happen. As they leave, King turns to Young and he tells him, we got to go out there and get this president some power. Over the coming days and weeks and months, people just like you and me, and I really mean that, everyday Americans, they took to the streets. They got on the courthouse steps, the state house steps. They wrote letters to their members of Congress. They lit up the switchboard at the White House until on the 7th of March, 1965, a 24-year-old John Lewis leads this incredible march for the right to vote, doing what everybody else was doing, but he happened to do it in Selma, that one place where King reminded Johnson that the whole ball game was laid out, this lack of democracy for those who had just won their civil rights. He leads that march, and the press are there to witness not just his courage and his heroism, but the fact that he is beaten almost to death for having the courage of his convictions. Those images are beamed out across the country. They're beamed out around the world. And in 8 days, which is political light speed, on the 15th of March, 1965, Johnson convenes a joint session of Congress, and that joint session and his speech are televised to America. He wants the world to know exactly what is going on. And his speech, and I'm paraphrasing, is something like, listen, members of the House and the Senate, as it was in Lexington and Concord, when we first won our independence and our freedom, as it was at that courthouse in Appomattox in 1865, when we settled the question of slavery and whether one person could hold another person in bondage in this country. So it is today in 1965 that we have brave Americans willing to lay down their lives so that we can realize this democracy. You have the chance here in Congress to give them the right to vote, for which they are marching, for which they are fighting, and yes, for which they are dying. By that summer of 1965, he's able to get Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, and he signs it into law, creating for the first time in American history a multiracial democracy.
That's right.
That lesson, which I connect to Nixon in 1924, saying, I've got to try, showing up to vote even though he can't. The 20 years he waited, the 20 years from his victory in 44 to 64 and that conversation in the White House to John Lewis crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 65, it is all of a piece. And what it teaches me is that action is the key to victory, and it is the antidote to despair. But for Nixon's action, we might not be having this conversation right now. We almost certainly might not have had the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. And I also know from talking to Nixon's daughter, who, believe it or not, is still alive, Edna McIver, that it also gave his father deep happiness
and fulfillment and joy. He found his purpose. He knew why he was here on this planet. And I feel the same way, though I'm nothing like him in terms of accomplishment or perseverance or courage. But I hope you do too when you're knocking on doors and meeting voters, when you're volunteering at the food bank, when you're voting, when you're getting after it and you're in the game and you're no longer on the sidelines watching it happen. No matter how hot the Texas sun is, when I'm knocking doors all day, meeting voters and getting people on the rolls, I'm so much happier at the end of the day than if I'd just been scrolling through social media or wondering how much worse it was going to get, watching people talk about the future of our country on cable news. Agency and action is the key to everything. And Nixon taught me that in researching his story. But there's a second lesson that he and the years that follow his story teach me. As you probably know, because we're all proud Texans, in 1975, the first Black woman to represent a congressional district from Texas, Barbara Jordan, leads the reauthorization of that historic Voting Rights Act in 1975. This time, she includes protection for language minorities. So we think about the immigrants who had been coming into our country, maybe working those fields in South Texas to provide the food that all of us depended on. Well, she was going to make sure that they could read the ballot, that they could run for office, that they could hold political power and help to change this country for the better, and they did. It's reauthorized again in the 80s, once more in the 90s, in the early 2000s, on broad bipartisan basis. Republican and Democratic presidents alike signed these reauthorizations into law. Until in 2013, just 11 years ago, the Supreme Court, a much different Supreme Court, they make a decision known as Shelby versus Holder, which concludes in all its infinite wisdom that we do not have a problem with voter protection, or voter suppression, or voter intimidation in this country anymore. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissent, said that that opinion was like pulling down your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because that umbrella has kept you dry this whole time, so probably you don't need it anymore. But the rain was still falling, and there were still those who were organized against the most vulnerable in our community, or those who had always been the targets of suppression and intimidation. And true enough, Texas, and it's always Texas, within minutes of Shelby versus Holder, which guts the Voting Rights Act, they imposed the toughest voter ID law in the country. They were literally, no exaggeration, waiting in the wings for this to happen and did not spare a day's time. In minutes, immediately disenfranchising hundreds of voters. In the coming years, they closed 700 polling places, more than twice the number of the next closest state. I don't have to tell you, almost all of those polling places are closed down in the fastest growing Black and brown neighborhoods in the state of Texas. You see these images every November. They show the lines outside of TSU in Houston. They're 6, 7, 8 hours long. And part of us is like, that's amazing. And someone's going to wait 8 hours to cast a ballot. Probably wouldn't do that. Thank God they're willing to. And then almost immediately you're consumed by shame and embarrassment that we would do this to another human being in what is supposed to be the world's greatest democracy. A 3-judge federal panel has found that the way that we carve up congressional districts is, in their words, not mine, a racial gerrymander. If you're Black or brown, there's a good chance you're going to be drawn out of the district where your vote has the power to decide the outcome into one where your vote has no power whatsoever. So let us remember that when we look at the low voter turnout in some of our recent elections, in the primaries that just took place, or when more than 9 million eligible voters didn't cast a ballot in 2022. And remember what was on the ballot. It wasn't Beto and Greg Abbott. It was 19 kids and 2 teachers who'd been slaughtered in their classroom in Uvalde. Not a single thing changed to make it any less likely that it happened to any other child in any other classroom. It was the fact that we had the most obscene abortion ban in America at a time that we are suffering a crisis of maternal mortality that is 3 times as deadly for women of color. It is the least insured state in the country. It's the fact that in 2021, the energy capital of the world could not keep the lights on, or the heat running, or the power going, and 700 Texans lost their lives, froze to death in their homes. Kids, veterans, people who should be the most honored and protected in our communities, in our state, and in our country. 9 million plus did not vote. Now, it is not that they do not care about what I just described, and certainly they're not lazy, nor do they lack any love for this great democracy. They have been drawn out, just as voters prior to 1965 have been drawn out. Now, they may not call it the white primary law in Texas anymore, but it is just as effective at keeping people out of the ballot box. What's my lesson that I take from that? It's this: no victory, no matter how just, how hard fought, or how hard won, is ever final. We may have thought that we won in 65 and the reauthorization in 75 when it came to the Voting Rights Act, but 2013 woke us up from our apathy and our slumber. The other side was fighting the whole way through, biding their time, waiting till there was an opening, and when there was, they struck. And remember, Texas was ready. There was a plan, and they executed perfectly. We saw the same thing in 2022, when the right for a woman to make her own decisions about her own health care, which had stood the test of time for half a century, was struck down by another Supreme Court majority. One in the consenting opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas said, after this, we're coming after contraception. We're coming after same-sex marriage. Every right that you think you had won, you thought that we were on a clear line of progress, that the arc of the moral universe bent towards justice, and it just bends. You don't have to do anything about it. You can sit back and watch Netflix, and it will take care of itself. No victory is ever final, which is my third and final lesson flows from that. And that's this. And look, this is to warn you, this can be daunting. This can be downright depressing, depending on how you look at it. I find it to be exhilarating, and it compels me to act. And that is, this fight will never be over. No matter how hard we try, how many of these races or victories we win, no matter how much change we produce, because no victory is final, the fight can never be over. And if you're getting tired just thinking about that, think about what the alternative is if we don't win or sustain these victories. And if you're tempted to give in and give up because the work is so hard, remember those who preceded us. Remember Dr. Nixon for 20 years fighting that lonely battle so that we could be here today. We are the heirs to their sacrifice, to their service, to their struggle. What we do with this inheritance, it defines us in the eyes of our kids in the pages of history. It determines exactly what our future will be. This fight will never be over. And the other side gets it perfectly well. They get it so well that when they lose the presidential election, they don't stop fighting. They incite insurrection. They use violence. They change our laws to disenfranchise voters all over this country. The guy at the top of the ticket on the other side, he's told us out loud in public he will be a dictator on day one. He has shown us that he will lead insurrection if he's unable to win power peacefully and democratically. And he's saying things that could be lifted from Mein Kampf or out of the mouth of Adolf Hitler. Immigrants poisoning the blood of this country. That is not who we are, certainly not at our best. So, thinking about those generations to come, our kids, our grandkids, their kids and grandkids, looking back on us now from the future, we want to be those who saved what was bequeathed to us by the generations that preceded our own, not those who squandered this grand inheritance. 247 years in, we cannot be the generation, we will not be the people who lose it. So no pressure, everybody, but this one, this year, and the rest of them, for as long as we draw a breath, it is all on us. Last thing that I want to say, some have come up to me after these talks in other places, in Little Rock, Arkansas, for example. Hey, Beto, I am fired up right now. You made the case. I love Dr. Nixon's story. I want to get back in this fight. What do I do? And in Little Rock, they have a ballot initiative. They have different laws than we have in Texas. We can't do this in our state, but they have a ballot initiative to put abortion on the ballot in November. And so outside of our meeting, there were 3 volunteers with clipboards who were signing people up to get their names on the petition so that the citizens of Arkansas could vote on whether or not a woman should have a choice in her own future. I love that. We could direct everyone there. Yesterday in Memphis, Tennessee, There were voter registrars who were getting people on the rolls right there at that bookstore. Today, here in Texas, we have volunteers from Powered by People who will do two things. One, if you or someone in your life is not currently on the rolls and registered to vote, we'll help you do that. And there's no shame at all. There are millions of Texans who are currently not on the rolls, and it's not by accident, it's by design, so let us help. The second thing, and maybe even more important, if you already are registered, but you're looking for another way to help, you can sign up with us, and we will train you to become a volunteer deputy registrar, which is a legal requirement to register other people to vote in the state of Texas. It's called VDR. We will help you to become a VDR. We have a number of volunteers here who will sign you up. You give us your email address, we follow up. It's a 20 minute training. 45? That's too long. Okay, 45, maybe it's 45 minutes all in, but it's a training. Is that to become a VDR?
Yes.
To become a VDR, you take a quick test to certify that you learned everything that you were trained on, and then you are street legal to sign people up here in Tarrant County to get on to the rolls. Is 45 minutes a lot of time?
No.
Yes. It is. Is this hard to do? Yes, it is. But yes, she answered the question the right way. Really, when you look at it in the scope of our history, this is nothing. 45 minutes against 20 years, I'll take 45 minutes. You do not want to look back after Election Day, November 2024, and say, man, I wish I had done something else. I mean, Colin, he came so close. Biden almost won the state of Texas, and that would have stopped Trump in his tracks, but I was too busy, or I thought I was too busy. I just didn't want to do the work. So I strongly encourage you to sign up with us today. When we're all leaving, after we've had a chance to have a conversation, Darini and Vita and the team that are here will help sign you up for a training to become a VDR. We'd love to have you on the team. So once again, I want to thank the doc for having me out here today. You all for joining us. Dave, how are you? This is the best way to end it. And after this, I'm getting on a plane and headed back home and seeing my family. So I cannot wait. So thank you all. If you have a question, if it's okay with you, I'll call on you. Just raise your hand. We'll bring you into the conversation. And afterwards, anyone who would like to buy a book, there's more to the story than what I told you. It's worth buying. I'm happy to stay around and sign and inscribe your book for you as well. But yeah, raise a hand if you have a question and we'll bring you in. Yes, please.
So, having recently taken on a new career path, I'm a deployed claim adjuster for State Farm. How soon can I get a mail-in ballot just in case I'm deployed in November?
It's a really good question. I'm going to make sure that someone from our team, you can answer, go for it.
I'm on the ballot board here in Tarrant County. You can sign up to get your ballot 45 days before the election. So we'll mail it to you. It will be mailed to you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for asking that. That's great. Thanks for answering it too.
I'm sure I have a question.
Yeah.
though. I'm from El Paso. When are you running again?
Oh. I don't know. You know what? I get to join all of our volunteers and volunteer with Powered by People doing voter registration. That's the most important thing I could be doing. Very fulfilling. But you know what? I'm open. And if at some point, at some year, I'm the right person to run that race and to help, awesome. But in the meantime, I want to get behind amazing candidates who are doing the work right now. Whether it's Colin at the top of the ticket, some of these important local Tarrant County races, we, Powered by People, I personally want to be helping out. And let me just say to everyone who is running right now, who's putting themselves out there, it couldn't be a more important time. Not only do you need to win your races, but when you're out there talking to voters, something else that Kat and I talked about, you're also winning votes, not just for yourself, but for everyone up and down the ballot. So just thanks for everyone who's putting themselves out there. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
We had so many seniors that did not vote in the election because they were sitting home waiting for their application to vote. We did not advertise that you don't get a ballot anymore at home or application. You have to request
issue.
to get the application, you know, years ago, and well, up to a couple of years, it came in the mail, and you have, you know, throw it off and send it back in the mail, but it no longer happens like that. You have to get your family members, your mothers and fathers and all, and let them know they have to request that application.
So really great point. And if you have to, because you're absentee, because you're unable to go to the polling place and you're going to vote by mail, make sure that you request it, make sure that you're on the right timeline. But if you can vote in person, I want to stress this.
Right.
Please vote in person. During the primaries in 22, Texas rejected 12% of the mail-in ballots. The previous high watermark was 1% of ballots rejected. They rejected 12 times the number of ballots. So when you do fill out that mail-in ballot, just like triple check that everything is correct. And again, if you can go in person during early voting, please go in person during early voting. Great point. Thank you.
Yeah, say something about the ballots real quick. Make sure that your older person puts their social security number and their Texas driver's license number. Right. Once for their driver or their personal ID. That's the number one reason why we did very much. I helped with the ballot board this last time. That was the number one thing. You did not have an ID on the outside.
Yep.
So make sure they put both social security number and their driver's license or their personal ID number.
Thank you. That's
You're
great.
welcome. Yeah, anytime.
We have a question, right?
So I have a question. So I have a lot of veteran friends in other states across the country, and a lot of people ask me, what, you know, they basically insinuate they've given up on Texas. So, and as you've traveled across the country, when people ask you or kind of show that they've kind of given up on Texas, what's your response to that?
Yes, questions about people who've given up on our state, and not that I ever advocate anybody spending time on social media, but very often when there's something about Texas, like Texas County bans pregnant women from driving on their roads to try to get out of state where they can legally obtain an abortion, or there's a horrific shooting, or you'll see people in the comments who say, you know what, that's Texas doing Texas, just leave them be. They kind of get what they deserve for having this crazy government, which is so cruel to every one of us who is not reflected in our government in a state that doesn't have a democracy fully, where most people aren't voting in these incredibly important elections. What's been interesting is I've been giving this talk and listening to people in states like Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Mississippi, in Georgia, other places where they're having a really hard, South Carolina, a really hard time voting as well. And they're living with the consequences just like we are. And they all get it. The rest of the country is sleeping on them too. And so in a way, I feel like we could band together now and just kind of buck each other up. I mean, look what happened in Georgia. I mean, who would have thought, say 10 years ago, that Joe Biden would have won the Electoral College vote in Georgia? First time the Democrats done that since the 90s. That not one, John Ossoff, but two, Raphael Warnock would win important Senate elections the next year. And then Warnock would win re-election again. Georgia, of all places, that happened. Now, Texas, Texas is not too unlike Georgia. We're just 3 times larger and have so much less money coming in. $28 was spent per Georgia voter by Democratic donors in 2020. So each voter, they spent $28 trying to get them out. In Texas that same year, $7 was spent per voter. It's no wonder we're getting these outcomes on top of all the suppression and intimidation. So what I tell people is that all these crazy things that you see in our government are not reflective of the people of Texas. No one wants these power outages. No one wants to lead the maternal mortality crisis, lead in school shootings, be the least insured, #1 in childhood diabetes deaths. Like that's, we used to say, thank God for Mississippi, because they were last in all these categories. Now Mississippi's saying, thank God for Texas. That's where we are, folks, right now. So, but no one's coming to save us. No cavalry riding to our rescue. I mean, this one is on us. And there's something liberating about that. Because when you think someone's going to help you out, it's like this moral hazard. Like, someone else is going to come in and do this. And when we had a Voting Rights Act, it was the Department of Justice. They would come in and enforce election law in Texas. Now it's us. It's on us. And you know what? I mean, looking around the room right now, I love our odds. We are good people. We have inherited what Nixon and so many others have done in this state. We have that same fighting spirit. We're going to try. Now, When will we win? I don't know. It's a function of time and effort. The more effort we put in, the more of us putting that effort in, the shorter the amount of time that we're going to have to wait. So I say don't give up on Texas. And listen, if you got to leave the state, and there's some families in a situation, a young woman who worked for me, for example, grew up in San Antonio, lives in DC now. She worked for me when she was in Congress, had moved up for the job. And she's about to have a second child. And she says, I want to have that kid in Texas. But my first pregnancy was very high risk. And my second pregnancy, though I want to have that kid in Texas, if we have a problem, what is the doctor going to do? There's no exception for the life of the mother in the state of Texas. There's no exception for rape in the state of Texas. She said, I don't know that I can trust Texas to do this. So if she has to stay out, I get it. But for those of us who can stay in and fight on her behalf and on everyone's behalf, we absolutely have to do. And imagine, how much fun we're going to have the night that we finally win one of these statewide elections here in Texas. And it's going to feel so good. That beer is going to taste so good. We're going to have so much fun. But it's going to come from the work that we're putting in. Thank you for asking the question. And listen, here we have the person who just asked a question, a veteran who has served our country, who has been doing the hard work in one of these rural counties where it's not always easy and sometimes unsafe to raise your hand and say, hey, I want to do better. And maybe even I'm a Democrat. And so, you've been putting in the work, and we're proud of you too for doing that. So thank you for doing
that. A question in the last two when we get started.
Great.
All right. I don't know if the Biden administration is asking for you any advice around activating young people. Texas, right, under 30 are registered voters. 20% of them are under 30. Only 4% have voted in the primary.
Right.
I don't know. So my question number one is ideas, strategies, advice on that. Because the number two is the battle with talking to Texans and people about why you should vote for Biden again is, this idea of the vibe that the economy is bad, but yet it's better than it's really ever been. Even when Trump was in his greatest year of 2019, we were having a great economy, stock market's up, all the stuff that they say is bad. But Bidenomics feels like it's actually working, even though people don't feel it or see it in our own wallet sometimes. How do you navigate both the young people and the austerity around the economy discussion when people say, oh, why would I vote for Biden? I have no money in my pocket.
On young people, I just think it's always best that we follow the lead of young people. I paraphrase that Johnson speech when he convened the joint session of Congress, and he talks about Concord and Lexington and Appomattox and Selma. In each of those three instances, and you could add in D-Day at Normandy, you could add in the people who were drafted to go fight in Vietnam. They're 18, they're 19, they're 20 years old. Everyone who won America's freedom at every major turn. Obviously, there's some exceptions, and there's some older folks like me sprinkled into the mix. But it was young people who were literally taking the bullets, literally getting firebombed, literally getting beaten unconscious, literally dying for our democracy. Young people. And it is young people today who have this fierce urgency about, you name it, any issue we talked about, including climate change, including our democracy and the right to vote. And so I think following the lead of those young people is so important. And if we listen to them right now, in addition to everything we've talked about, young people are talking about immigration, but they're not talking about it in the same way that our elected leaders are, where it's like, we got to shut down the border, we got to close this thing off, we got to send everybody back, we're going to round them all up and put them in detention camps and deport them. Young people are like, hey, I thought I remembered you guys talking about dreamers and finding a pathway to citizenship for the millions who are undocumented, who've been working here for like 20, 30, 40 years. Where'd you go? Young people who see 31,000 people killed in Gaza, the vast majority of them are women and children, and they're being killed with weapons and bombs that were made here and were sent over to our ally in Israel. And those young people who've been raising their voice, this makes me so proud of them. They're changing the direction this country is taking. I just read an interview with President Biden this morning. He's using the word ceasefire. They avoided that word like the plague for the first, few months of this war. And now he's calling for a ceasefire. They're airlifting aid into Gaza. They're going to build a humanitarian dock to be able to get that stuff in by sea. Is it enough? No. but he's moving in the right direction. And I tell you what, young people are going to see that their voices, their protest votes in Michigan, they're making a difference. This voting really works, and it really counts. And my hat's off to the president for listening to them and reflecting their urgency in the work that he's doing. The other guy, not only would he be so much worse on these issues, he could care less what any of us, including and maybe especially young people, think. So I think more of that from the president, and we should all help him, whether he asks us to or not. Let's get on those college campuses, high school campuses, go to those apprenticeship programs and listen to young people about what's most important to them. On the economy, I still hear young people connecting these two issues, talking about student debt that they've taken. Student debt became so crushing, they couldn't finish their degree program. So now they have tens of thousands of dollars in debt. They don't have the degree or the certification, and they're really in a hole that's just getting deeper every day. The president has canceled, so much of that debt. There's more to do. We got to keep pushing him. We got to keep pushing Congress to do their absolute max. And then we got to acknowledge, business owners like those here who have seen their costs go up over the last 3 years, 4 years, and they haven't come back down again. They may not be rising as fast, and a lot of credit goes to Biden for slowing the growth of inflation, but the costs haven't come back down. What I loved in his State of the Union, you probably saw this, where he was calling out the enemy. These corporations, they're shrinking the size of the Snickers bar. They're putting fewer potato chips in the bags. Their profits are obscene. You have never seen in American history this concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few in these corporations. And I think when he talks about building an economy out from the middle and asking the very wealthiest and those corporations to pay their fair share, I think young people see that justice. I hope. These are excellent questions. And I think actually the election hinges on the president's ability to answer them. The economy and how people feel it and what they have to look forward to, and whether young people turn out. I think in the 6 battleground states that have been certified by both parties, the president won, I think on average by less than 1%. What we all did in Texas in 18, young voter turnout up 500%. We need to do that again on behalf of the president. Thanks for asking.
All right. Oh, here,
Right over here.
I was going to say, you mentioned paying attention to local Tarrant County races. I don't think we've carried a Democrat down ballot. You carried Tarrant County, and so did Biden. We haven't carried a Democrat down ballot, I think, in like 30 years, before I was born. Over 30 years. And I'm just wondering, what are you willing to do to help us win down ballot in Tarrant County?
Yeah, I mentioned that this is day 20 of 20, and is also the only stop in the state of Texas. And the only place I came to was Tarrant County in Fort Worth. And it's because what you just said. And listen, for those who only focus on top of ballot, the only way top of ballot happens is if down ballot is happening. If you have competitive, well-funded, well-organized, well-volunteered, high voter turnout races for every race below U.S. Senate, then U.S. Senate then has a fighting chance. When some people talked about coattails that we provided in 18, really it kind of worked the other way around. All those competitive state house seats, those votes flowed up the ballot to us against Ted Cruz. So we're with you in these races. We want to make sure that we're helping the folks who are putting themselves out there right now. So one thing that we're doing that's just a concrete step is we're focusing our voter registration efforts in counties like Tarrant County, because we know that bringing net new Democratic voters on, staying in touch with them, helping them to turn out means that our candidates are more likely to win. And then beyond that, if we can do anything through our social media, through our ability to reach voters in these places, put us to work. We want to help you. So we'll get contact information after this and make sure that we're following up.
The biggest race that we have in Tarrant County is the sheriff race.
Yes.
And there's a human rights crisis happening in our jail. And I don't know if our county's aware of it. There's another death today in our jail. It's been the 63rd death since the current administration has taken over our jail. And I don't think our county knows about it.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for raising this, and then let's make sure we talk after this to find out how we can do this.
I have one more question, and that was you got. I'm sorry, but you can get it to Vince, and then that'll be it. I'm sorry. Can't tell her no. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I know you're not running, I know you're not a candidate. But hypothetically, if you were, how important the reparations be? Where would that fall on number two as a people? Do you think, or do you feel like we should make that an issue, or at least make the candidate that we want to vote on, have that at the top priority?
It's interesting, I mentioned being in Montgomery, in addition to being the home of all those other things that I just talked about, the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, who I think has really supercharged this conversation in our country. And I had the chance to sit down with him, and I asked him this very question. I said, I as a member of Congress, supported the reparations bill that John Conyers and then Sheila Jackson Lee had introduced. But Mr. Stevenson, what does that look like? What is that money? Is it a payout? Is it, how do you do this? And he said, you know what it looks like is telling the story of this country. And the reason that he helped to found that museum in Alabama is to make sure that we understand the real cost and consequence of what happened in this country following Reconstruction into Jim Crow, all the way to today in our jails and in our communities in the year of our Lord 2024. The point I thought he was making so effectively, and I'm probably not doing it justice, is that until everyone's brought into the story, you'll never move forward. He said in South Africa, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It forced everybody in that country to realize what the apartheid government had done. In Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis had to learn that shared history. After we defeated the Nazis, we made the Germans go to the concentration camps and see what happened. Like, you will not deny your history. Everyone's going to understand what happened. In America, following the end of slavery, the end of Jim Crow, there was never a reckoning or an accounting or sharing of our story. And in Texas, they are outlawing the books that are being sold in this bookstore right now in our schools. They don't want you to know Dr. Lawrence Nixon's story under the auspice of critical race theory. That if it's ever taught, it's taught at a graduate school level and is not taught to seventh graders, despite what Greg Abbott will tell you. They're trying to deny us our story. And when they deny us our story, we lose connection and empathy and political will to actually do what you just described. So I do think it's a conversation worth having. And you know what? I think we are beginning to have that, at least here, talking about how we got to this point. And then I think once we do that, we can take the next steps going forward. So I appreciate you asking.
Last question. Okay, that's the last question, I'm sorry.
So up until 22, Tarrant County did have Senator Powell, who was a Democrat and fought really hard. She was very famous for doing her military. She's all privileges, Latino, Republicans like this. And so Tarrant County, they know that seat to be only in Tarrant County. That seat now has both the same counties, and that's because of how badly that county is.
Yeah.
So for your county or other races, you absolutely can vote them, and they know that. That's why they should.
Yeah.
Oh, I plan to win. All right. Okay, that's it for the questions. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me.
Make sure those that need to get their book signed, get their signs, we're gonna set this up.
Thank you all for attending. Here's the process for the book signing and the photos. We're going to, of course, acknowledge our DOC members. So you DOC members, please raise your hand. If you, well, your DOC member and pre-order the book, come forward. So DOC members come forward. Okay, and so in the line, let's do the line. So line. All right, so DOC members, please come forward and get in line. And if you can get behind our DOC members. So Right. Not members, and you pre-ordered it first, and then